Here, the first order and the last hope. Build a bridge, under fire, before the river swallows an army. In March 1945, the Rhine ran cold and fast beneath smashed piers and broken spans. German guns owned the far bank. Allied planners said a crossing would take days. The front said it had hours. Into that gap stepped a combat engineer officer with a notebook full of Bailey and Treadway tables, a voice that carried over shell bursts, and a single brutal equation: span the river or lose the men. Archival logs from U.S. engineer regiments and nice troops carrier command lists describe it in the plain grammar of war: site selected, bank prepared, rafts launched, bridge begun under observed fire. The math of survival started at the waterline. Night hid the first stakes. Bulldozers, muffled with sandbags, crawled to the shore. Surveyors paced out abutments by red-lensed flashlights, counting in strides, not feet, because tape glinted. Assault boats ferried a security platoon across, upstream from the work, to burn precious minutes out of the enemy's eyes. Then the engineers brought up the heart of the thing: steel bays, transoms, stringers, modular faith bolted together. No elegance, only endurance. A Bailey could grow like a spine, bay by bay, launched on rollers and floated by pontoons, then shoved toward the black water until it felt and fought the current. The river struck back. A minefield on the near bank took the first casualty team. Counter-battery fire probed the staging road, walking shells toward the stockpile of decking. Shrapnel stitched the canvas of the work rafts. Pumps whined, then caught, then whined again. Still the officer's watch marked the rhythm: lift, pin, drive, launch, while runners moved between tools and timber like nerves in a living thing. On the far bank, a German observer radioed corrections from a church spire. On the near bank, a sergeant leveled the spire with a 57 millimeter, one round through slate, one through doubt. Before midnight, the first tank drowned the approach, nose first into churned clay, and the column behind it began to accordion. 5,000 troops and vehicles were stacked on roads that had no more time. The bridge had 3 bays in the river and needed 40. The men had 1 more hour and needed dawn. By the early hours, the Rhine had turned into a mirror of fire. Each muzzle flash from the German side lit the engineers for a fraction of a second. Enough for enemy gunners to aim, enough for death to cross the river. Yet still they worked. Under that light, the silhouettes of men lifted steel and timber, their helmets flashing in the glow of explosions. The bridge wasn't just metal anymore. It was defiance, hammered into place 1 pin at a time. Every piece of the Bailey structure had a number, every bolt a purpose. But none of that mattered without men to carry them. They had no cranes, only muscle and timing. As the first section locked into place, the German artillery switched to airbursts. Shrapnel hissed across the surface of the water like rain. The engineers crouched, waited for the storm to pass, then stood again, moving forward through the smoke, dragging sections by ropes slick with mud and blood. Reports from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion later recorded that the officer in charge refused to stop construction, even after a shell cratered the near approach. He ordered the damaged sections rebuilt on the spot. "If the road disappears," he told his sergeants, "we'll build the road too." It wasn't bravado, it was necessity. Behind them, thousands of men waited with no other way across. As dawn bled into the horizon, the river turned silver. Smoke clung to the surface like a living thing. And through it, the bridge began to take shape, a jagged skeleton stretching from one world to another. Allied spotters saw it through binoculars and couldn't believe it. They'd been told no one could build under that kind of fire, but the engineers did. They laid Treadway pontoons across the deepest span, connecting Bailey sections that had no business standing, and somehow they held. By midday, the Germans realized what was happening. Machine guns opened from hidden bunkers, firing low across the water. Mortars followed. The bridge shook under impact, bolts rattling loose, men diving flat as fragments whined overhead. But when the smoke cleared, the engineers were still there, crouched, soaked, and silent, tightening those same bolts with bare bleeding hands. By noon, the situation had reached its breaking point. The engineers were exhausted, their uniforms soaked in river water and sweat. their hands raw from hauling steel. Yet every man understood what was at stake. Behind them, 5,000 soldiers, infantry, armor, medics, and supplies, waited for the crossing. The entire advance depended on one bridge that didn't yet exist. German artillery observers on the far bank adjusted their aim with precision born of desperation. They knew that if the Americans finished the crossing, their defensive line would crumble. The first shells struck the riverbank, throwing mud and debris high into the air. Then the next volley hit the bridge itself. One section was blown apart, sending fragments and men into the current. The engineers didn't run. They pulled the dead aside, replaced the panels, and kept building. Official U.S. Army records later described this as sustained engineering under direct fire, a phrase that could never capture the chaos of those hours. The ground trembled constantly. The smell of diesel and cordite filled the air. Medics worked beside welders, and the noise of hammering mixed with the whine of incoming shells. Every few minutes, someone shouted for replacement parts, and someone else ran them through the barrage. The officer in charge, his face blackened with smoke, moved from team to team, shouting above the thunder. His only command was simple: keep going. That order became the rhythm of survival. They worked through everything: broken equipment, collapsing pontoons, and waves that carried away their supplies. Even the German machine gunners seemed astonished that the bridge refused to stop growing. By late afternoon, the first half of the structure was complete. Tanks were already lining up, ready to cross the instant the far span was secured. The engineers could see them waiting. Steel silhouettes against the smoky horizon, patient and deadly. It was motivation enough to continue. As night fell, tracer rounds streaked across the sky like fireflies. The river glowed faintly red beneath the flames of burning fuel. Still, the bridge extended, section by section, meter by meter, across the Rhine. Each man on that river knew he might not see sunrise. But as long as one beam held and one hammer swung, the crossing would go on. The night was alive with fire. Explosions flickered on both banks, casting long shadows over the engineers who refused to stop. Floodlights from the American side pierced the smoke, illuminating the river where men waded waist-deep to align the final pontoons. The sound of hammering, clanking, and shouted commands echoed through the chaos. By midnight, the bridge was 3/4 complete. The enemy knew it and intensified their barrage. Shells rained down in unbroken rhythm. Each explosion sent sprays of water and shrapnel in every direction. When one pontoon was torn apart, 2 men leapt into the current, ropes tied around their waists to drag the next section into place. They moved as if the war around them didn't exist. On the far bank, flashes of German muzzle fire revealed enemy silhouettes. Riflemen, machine gunners, and mortars dug into the hills, but they couldn't stop what was coming. American artillery responded in waves, firing from the opposite shore. The ground shook as the big guns answered, trading thunder for thunder. By 2 a.m., the engineers could barely see through the smoke and dust. Their floodlights had been shattered, and the river reflected only the glow of distant fires. They worked by instinct, laying beams, driving bolts, tightening cables with their bare hands. Every few minutes, someone fell silent, struck by fragments or sniper fire. Their comrades didn't pause. The fallen were pulled aside, and the bridge continued to grow. Reports from officers described the moment simply: progress maintained despite total visibility loss. What those words didn't capture was the fear, the deafening sense that death could arrive from any direction. Yet through it all, the bridge advanced another meter and another. At 3 a.m., the first tank engines roared to life. The bridge wasn't finished, but the risk of waiting was too great. A Sherman rumbled forward, its treads grinding against wet steel. The entire structure groaned under the weight. Every man held his breath. The tank reached the midpoint. The bridge held. A cheer went up from the engineers. Not one of triumph, but relief. It was proof that their work, their pain, their sleepless night had meant something. The Germans saw it too, and they understood what it meant. The crossing had begun. By dawn, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the full scale of the night's work. Across the river, the skeletal shape of the bridge stretched from bank to bank, shimmering in the morning light. Smoke drifted above the water like a ghostly curtain, but behind it, Tanks and trucks were already rumbling across. The impossible had been done. The German artillery did not stop. Shells still crashed along the banks, sending geysers of water and dirt into the air. But their fire was too late. The Americans had their foothold. What began as a desperate engineering gamble had turned into a lifeline for an entire army. As the 1st Armored Division crossed, the engineers stood aside, faces blackened with soot and oil. They looked more like miners than soldiers, their uniforms soaked, their hands blistered, their eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. Some leaned on shovels and rifles like walking sticks. Others stared in silence, watching the endless line of men and machines roll past. A captain later wrote, "We didn't cheer when the tanks crossed. We just watched. It was like watching history move over something we built with our own hands." The bridge itself was a marvel of improvisation. Half of it constructed from salvaged pontoons, the rest from whatever could float. It had been designed to hold a few light vehicles, yet by sunrise it carried full-loaded Shermans, trucks, and infantry columns without collapsing. Every creak and shudder was a reminder of how fragile victory could be. By midday, more than 5,000 men had crossed. The engineers were told to rest, but few did. They knew the Germans might counterattack at any moment. Instead of sleeping, they reinforced the structure, replaced damaged sections, and dragged spare planks from the shore. The smell of oil and burnt metal hung over the river. On the far bank, the tanks formed up for the next push, deeper into enemy territory. The bridge behind them was now the artery of the offensive, the only path for reinforcements and supplies. Its survival meant the survival of the entire operation. For the first time in days, the engineers allowed themselves a small moment of pride. They had built something under fire that wasn't meant to last, yet it was holding, strong as iron. As night approached again, they prepared for whatever came next. The bridge might endure another day, it might not, but they would. Night fell over the river once more, bringing with it an eerie calm. The thunder of artillery had moved east, following the advance. Only the groan of the bridge and the steady splash of the current broke the silence. The engineers worked by lantern light now, dim and flickering, casting long shadows across the wet planks. They were rebuilding the bridge even as it was used. Every passing tank left its mark. Loosened bolts, cracked beams, bent plates. The men patched holes with anything they could find. Spare steel, wire, even timber torn from destroyed buildings nearby. It was improvisation turned into survival. The enemy, however, was not done. Around midnight, the air suddenly split with the sound of aircraft. The engineers looked up as the black shapes of bombers appeared overhead. The Germans had found the crossing. Within seconds, the night was ablaze with explosions. The first bombs missed the mark, sending columns of water skyward. The second wave struck closer. One detonation snapped half the bridge loose from its moorings. The entire structure lurched, and men were thrown into the river below. Those who survived scrambled back to shore, dragging debris and wounded comrades from the freezing water. But even as the bombing continued, the engineers refused to abandon the bridge. Working in teams, they fought the fire, cut loose the destroyed sections, and began replacing them. Under the flash of explosions, they hauled new pontoons into position, hammering them together with desperate speed. One officer later recalled, "It wasn't bravery, it was stubbornness. We couldn't let that bridge die. Too many depended on it." By dawn, the attack had stopped. Smoke drifted low over the water, and the river was littered with wreckage, pieces of metal, broken boats, burned gear. But the bridge still stood. Barely. When the sun rose, the tanks began to cross again. Their treads clanked over the patched planks, shaking the entire span. Every crossing felt like a gamble, but the engineers kept it open, guiding each vehicle across, wave after wave. That day, an officer sent a simple message to headquarters: "Bridge operational, casualties heavy, crossing continues." Behind that dry report was a story of impossible endurance. Men who refused to yield even when the river, the sky, and the enemy turned against them. By the morning of the second day, the riverbank looked like a vision from hell. Burned-out trucks lined the shore, twisted metal jutted from the mud, and the remains of pontoon sections floated downstream like ghosts. Yet in the center of it all, the bridge held, blackened, trembling, but alive. The engineers had barely slept. Their uniforms were soaked and stiff from river water and sweat, their hands raw from rope burns and steel splinters. But there was no time to rest. The German artillery had found their range again. Shells began landing upriver, creeping closer with every shot. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the fragile structure. Every detonation loosened bolts, rattled joints, and sent shards of debris into the current. Still, the bridge had to stay open. Hundreds of vehicles waited on the far side, and behind them, thousands of soldiers depending on that crossing. The engineers worked in silence now, communicating with hand signals over the roar. Some crawled under the bridge to reinforce the pontoons. Others ran fresh cables from shore to shore. The smell of fuel and burning wood mixed with gunpowder in the stench of the river. It was mechanical chaos, but it was order born of experience. Then, just after noon, the worst happened. A shell struck the near shore, collapsing the first approach ramp. Trucks jammed in panic, drivers shouting and reversing. The entire line threatened to spill into the river. For a moment, it seemed the crossing would fail, but the lead engineer, exhausted, filthy, half-deaf from the blast, climbed onto the wreckage and waved his men forward. Under fire, they began building a new ramp directly atop the rubble. Using logs, planks, and broken girders, they constructed a makeshift path wide enough for a single tank. Hours passed like minutes. The bridge groaned and shifted, yet one by one, the vehicles crossed. Each time a tank reached the far bank, cheers rose from the opposite shore, brief flashes of hope amid the smoke. That night, when the shelling finally eased, the men collapsed where they stood. Some slept on the bridge itself, too tired to move. Others sat staring into the river, the glow of fires reflecting in their eyes. The officer in charge looked across the water, to the columns of men in armor stretching into the distance, and realized the truth. The bridge was more than steel and wood. It was the lifeline of an army, and so long as it stood, no one here would quit. At dawn, a thin mist clung to the river like a veil. Through it, the bridge looked almost peaceful, a ribbon of steel and timber floating on calm water. But beneath that quiet surface, the engineers knew the truth. The Germans were regrouping. The next barrage could come at any moment. They moved quickly, inspecting the damage. Overnight, several pontoons had been hit by shrapnel. One section sagged dangerously near the center span. Fuel drums used to reinforce the flotation had sprung leaks, leaving dark streaks across the current. Every sound, every creak of metal, every splash made the men tense. Still, they repaired. They scavenged parts from wrecked vehicles, cut replacement planks from broken crates, and patched holes with whatever they could find. It wasn't engineering anymore. It was survival through ingenuity. By mid-morning, the first trucks of reinforcements began to arrive. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, everything that the trapped division on the far bank needed. The engineers waved them across, timing each crossing to the rhythm of the river's current. The bridge flexed with every load, but it held. Then came the air raid. The sound of engines approached from the west. Faint at first, then unmistakable. Stukas. Their sirens tore through the air like screams from another world. The men scattered for cover as the first bombs fell, the blasts throwing mud and water skyward. When the smoke cleared, the bridge was still there, but barely. One pontoon had been shredded, another half submerged. The far ramp had collapsed under the weight of a truck that now burned at the water's edge. Yet somehow, against all odds, it was still standing. The officer commanding the engineers made a decision no manual could teach. They would keep the bridge open, even under direct attack. Men crawled across the structure, hammering, bolting, reinforcing as explosions rained around them. Every minute brought another crossing. Every hour meant hundreds more lives saved. By evening, the smoke from the bombings drifted away with the wind. On the opposite shore, the division that had once been trapped was now fully across. More than 5,000 men, tanks, and vehicles. The bridge had done its job. The engineers stood silently, watching the last of the convoy disappear into the distance. Their faces were black with soot and exhaustion, but behind the dirt was pride. the quiet kind that doesn't speak, only endures. As the sun sank behind the ruins of the riverbank, one of them looked back at their creation, the battered, half-sinking bridge that had defied destruction, and whispered a thought shared by them all. This is what we built for. Night fell like a curtain over the river. The bridge lay silent now, its planks slick with oil and rain, its pontoons groaning softly in the current. The engineers worked by lantern light, their faces pale and hollow in the glow. The air smelled of smoke and wet steel, the scent of a battlefield that had survived its own death. For the first time in 2 days, there was no gunfire, no artillery, just the steady rhythm of the river and the distant hum of retreating engines. The last units had crossed hours earlier, leaving the engineers behind to dismantle what they had built. Orders had come down. The bridge must be destroyed before dawn to keep the enemy from following. It was a cruel irony to tear down what had just saved thousands of lives, yet every man understood. That was the nature of war. Build 1 hour, destroy the next. They moved methodically, setting charges along the spans they had risked their lives to hold together. Each man placed the explosives with care, as if handling something sacred. The officer in charge, the same one who had ordered the bridge built under fire, checked every fuse himself. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from fatigue. As the final wires were connected, a hush fell over the group. They stepped back from the bridge, now scarred and bent, but still proud. The river flowed black beneath it, reflecting the faint light of the moon. For a moment it almost looked peaceful again, as if the chaos of war had been nothing more than a bad dream. Then with a single command, the silence broke. The charges detonated in a chain of thunderous flashes. The bridge erupted into light and smoke, the sound rolling across the valley like the breath of a giant. Pieces of timber and metal rained into the water, sending waves crashing against the shore. When it was over, nothing remained but drifting debris and the faint echo of what once was. The engineers stood there in the dark, watching the current carry away the remnants of their work. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They all knew what the bridge had meant, not just to the men it saved, but to themselves. It was proof that courage could be built plank by plank, under fire, one desperate moment at a time. As dawn began to rise, painting the horizon in pale gold, the officer finally turned away. He looked back once more at the river and whispered quietly, "Let it rest." Behind him, the men shouldered their gear and began the long walk toward their next assignment. Somewhere down the road, another river waited, another crossing to build, another impossible order to follow. But this one, this bridge, would be remembered. By the time the sun climbed above the horizon, the river had returned to silence. The bridge was gone, swept away by the current, its broken timbers drifting downstream like ghosts. The engineers were already miles away, marching toward new orders. But the memory of what they had done lingered. In the river, in the mud, and in the lives they had saved. Word of their work spread quickly through the ranks. Soldiers who had crossed that fragile bridge under fire told stories of how the engineers had refused to abandon their post, even as shells rained down. They spoke of the man who stood waist-deep in freezing water to guide the pontoons, of the crews who hammered nails with shaking hands while tracer fire cut the air above them. To the retreating army, that bridge had been more than wood and rope. It had been hope made real. When headquarters received the report, the commanding general wrote only one line in his diary. Without those engineers, 5,000 men would be lost. It was a simple sentence, but for the men who had been there, it meant everything. Many of them wouldn't live to see the end of the war, but that crossing became part of their legacy, an invisible monument built not of stone, but of courage. In the years that followed, the story of the bridge was retold again and again, sometimes in brief mentions, sometimes in full retellings. Each version changed slightly, but the core remained the same. One team of engineers, one impossible task, and one night that defied the odds. Historians would later identify it as one of the most daring engineering feats of the war. Some compared it to the ancient armies of Rome building bridges under enemy attack. Others saw it as a symbol of the quiet, often unseen heroism that wins wars not through glory, but through endurance. The officer who led that mission returned home after the war. He rarely spoke of what happened by the river. When asked, he would only smile faintly and say, "It was just a bridge." But those who knew him said that sometimes in the quiet moments, he would glance at the nearest river or the curve of a steel span and fall silent, lost in thought. He never saw himself as a hero, but to the 5,000 men who crossed that night, soaked, exhausted, alive, he was more than that. He was the man who gave them a path when none existed. In the end, history remembers generals and battles, victories and defeats. But in the chaos of war, there are moments that belong to those who simply refused to give up, who built when others ran, who held when others broke. And somewhere beneath the waters of that long-forgotten river lie the remains of a bridge that once carried an army to safety. A bridge built under fire, and the story of one engineer who made it possible. The river flows on, but the memory endures. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.